As we wrap up 2020, we're also wrapping up our Daring Voices dialogue series. What I thought we would do in the last Daring Voice is really look internally and think about what we learned this past year. It is the end of the year after all. And specifically, what did we learn vis-a-vis the US elections and our issues? So I interviewed 5 incredible PSFG members in 5 to 10 minute chunks, which you'll see in the next slide, so you can kind of pick and choose. And I asked them to think about, what did the US elections mean for your issues, and what lessons might we draw from that moving forward? What have you heard from grantees? What are we missing? What are some lessons you might leave with your peer funders? So in the next slide, you'll see a kind of table of contents, so you can pick and choose. Maybe you'll listen to one interview, maybe you'll listen to all 5, but you'll see in the next slide how we broke it out. Before you dig in though, I wanted to give you my top takeaways that I heard across all 5 interviews. First, that the fight isn't over. Yes, we have an incoming President Biden who shares many of our values, but as we saw this last year alone, there were racial uprisings here in the US and globally. There was a deepening of societal tensions and divisions. There were a lot of hate crimes and dangerous speech that were unprecedented in any time in history. And knowing that many of our grantee partners are struggling, especially during the COVID era, to make ends meet, let alone thrive, what I heard across all the interviews was that we need to keep supporting peace and security work. We can't just take a step back. We need to keep supporting it on a deeper level and in more expansive ways. Number 2, fund grassroots people-led movements. We've demonstrated this over the years, the importance of funding locally led peace-building efforts within the PSFG community. If you've forgotten, there's a ton of resources on the PSFG website, white papers, interviews, tear-out sheets of how to actually do it. Better yet, you can speak to some of your peers who are actually doing this and seeing results. Pick up the phone, or you can Zoom somebody if you're not too tired of it, and just ask them what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what kind of results they're seeing by funding people-led movements. I would suggest you call Mike or Caroline at Wellspring, Bridget or Dylan at Peace Direct. I have an interview with Bridget in the next slides, or Ellen or Hani at the Compton Foundation. The third lesson that I heard across all of these interviews was that funding grassroots movements is really, really important. And more important than that is to fund cross-sectoral grassroots movement in order to begin to build power, not just in our sector, but with other sectors. We here at PSFG are providing you opportunities to do exactly that. We have partnered just most recently with human rights funders and democracy funders to bring to you the Global Rights Summit. It's upcoming next year. I sent an email around a couple of weeks ago to the listserv asking you all to submit sessions to join peer funders to talk about how we might bring together the various funder movements to push back against a global anti-rights, anti-democracy movement that we're seeing from conservative funders. So I hope that you'll come to this multi-month summit and that we can strategize on building power across with like-minded funders. The fourth lesson, the fourth takeaway I heard across all the 5 interviews was that funders have a critical role to play in dismantling systems of white supremacy, including problems that we have in our own backyards here in the US and in Europe and in our sector. As you know, we at PSFG have been interrogating ways that we can inject diversity, equity, and inclusion into all that we do as an organization and as a network. We have, as you know, a live Google Doc that gets updated all the time with resources for you. We are speaking out about our lessons learned as an organization, and we're weaving this important lifelong work into everything that we do moving forward. We know that the root of conflict is inequality, so our work can't move forward effectively without addressing this. If you want to know more about the myriad opportunities that we have for you to dive into this work with us, if you haven't already, many of you have, please be in touch with any of the PSFG staff, and we are happy to provide you a menu of options for where to start on this journey. The minimum we should all be doing is learning. So check out the Google Doc. There are articles, there are videos, if you're more of a visual person, there are books, and better yet, start to look at your grants and your programs with a critical DEI lens. You can start doing this today. The fifth and final lesson that I took away from all of the interviews was that we need creativity and courage these next few years to build back better, as President-elect Biden would say. Clearly, we're in a new era of history, and as you all know, I am a perennial optimist, so I like to look at the opportunities that these changes have afforded us. We know we can't go back to business as usual for so many reasons, including that before these end times, life wasn't great for many people. So what can we be doing differently? What can we be doing creatively? How can we push boundaries together? How can you push your own boundaries? How can we stretch your power as funders to contribute positively to our next phase, whatever that may be, and how do we build that together as a community? Perhaps you can set money aside, a small or a large pot of money, to take some of these risks now, to experiment, to try different things. This is what we've been doing with this Daring Voices series. You might fail, that's for sure, but you know that if you can't risk, you won't necessarily see any of the rewards. So why not try it? So as I said, we are wrapping up our Daring Voices series. We hope that you enjoyed it. If you didn't, also tell me that. As you know, I am a big proponent of constructive criticism and take feedback, I think, well to integrate into our programs to best serve you in this sector. Enjoy, and thank you so much for being with us. So Joe Biden just won the election a couple weeks ago. We are still not sure what the Senate will look like for our issues. So obviously that remains to be seen, and it's important. But I do want to ask you about what you think, coming from the nuclear policy realm, and especially having had experience and worked in the government itself, what are the opportunities? What do the next 4 years look like in nuclear policy in light of this election?
It's a really good question. The next 4 years are going to provide more opportunities than we've seen in the last four, but nothing's a guarantee. For our issue, this period actually between the election results and the inauguration, we still may see further challenges, especially when it comes to Iran. At this point in time, the news story came out just this week that Trump considered a military strike against Iran. And this has been one of our fears just as we approached this time period. The Trump administration is very good at dismantling institutions and throwing up roadblocks and obstacles. So it's not over until it's over. And once we get to January, we'll have a clearer picture of what it holds. In terms of what we expect to see coming in the next 4 years, the president-elect has expressed a willingness to go back into the Iran deal, to extend a new start. So we anticipate that left to their own devices, you would see a return to 2016. I mean, you're seeing this in terms of who they're nominating and considering for various positions. For them, you're hearing a lot about stability and return to normalcy, but it's not 2016. We have the recession, we have the pandemic, and we have 4 years of learning of what was broken. And added to this, the election results, it's clear that Trump was not an aberration. The next 4 years provide an opportunity, if civil society wants to take it, to pressure the Biden administration to take the steps they actually want to see. So in that sense, it's, spending less on defense for nuclear weapons. It's not rebuilding the land-based missiles that we have here in the United States. It's deeply investing in arms control. I mean, this is where you start talking about, do we want to ever return to testing or things like that? And I think this is where, the racial justice uprisings you saw this summer also point to a broader conversation of, what actually makes us secure. And, from where I sit, nuclear weapons do not make us safer. We are paying money and investing time in things that make us less safe. So, but it will be up to civil society to actually try to change that trajectory, no pun intended.
You mentioned lessons learned. So you're speaking to a group of funder peers in the Peace and Security Funders Group. What lessons could we learn from how philanthropy and how funders did or didn't engage in previous administrations, be it Trump or Obama administration, when you, I believe, served in the Department of Energy. What do we need to be doing differently now?
So I think the biggest takeaway, is something I think about in the context of the United States, but I think it applies more broadly, knowing that many of our members are really focused in other spaces. We can't do what we did in 2008, where we took money out of the grassroots infrastructures that had developed to resist bad policy and put them into capitals, into experts, to try to create an inside the beltway or inside the capital type change. It's cheaper. It's alluring, but at the end of the day, it is a shortcut that will make any gains we have easier to roll back. And so I think in the United States, right, this means that we can't neglect Congress just because you have an executive branch who is advancing the policies that you want to see. Many of our theories of change are fundamentally based on democracy, right? This concept that people outside of government can have change. We got to put our money where our mouth is in order to make that mechanism a reality and to strengthen it. Serving in government, you realize it's easy to get buried down in a low-level office where they will just keep doing the work. Sure, they listen to what goes on at the outside, in civil society, but at the end of the day, like, you're really focused on your specific little corner. And it requires high-level pressure, which is not always welcome, in order to create change. I think it was FDR who originally said it. Obama repeated it. Now make me do it. And that's what we have to do. We have to go out and make them do it.
So Plowshares does take pride in funding civil society, grassroots efforts, advocacy efforts. You mentioned Capitol Hill. What else could funders be funding, again, like based on the lessons learned from pre-Trump, Trump era, Obama era? What are some things that we're not seeing? What are some things that you're seeing, given that you are, a bit of an edgier funder and that you can do that? What are things that you would ask your fellow funders to consider in this new era?
What do local policies have to do with your issue? And what does funding in a truly local grassroots context have to do with your issue? I know the limitations that come with, the type of entity you are. As you said, we are able to fund advocacy and specifically we're able to fund lobbying. But there's so much that you can do in terms of education and engagement that has nothing to do with bills. But you need this active citizenry that cares and is willing to speak out for their issue in order to see gains. And so I think making those local investments, which I get it, like this is almost the opposite of scaling, but you need it in order to have a healthy society. And I think the biggest challenge that we're going to be facing is this continued pressure around the world on civil society spaces, this new repression. And, the way that you push back on that isn't just through federal or national level policies, it's day-to-day work in communities.
And you made mention of partnering with fellow funders that are not squarely in the peace and security space, so like the democracy space. There's a whole set of funders who are funding and working on how do you revive, U.S. democracy specifically, but also just democracy globally. It's thinking about a bit more creatively and thinking a bit more cross-sectorally, and not just, locally for sure, global, local, domestic, but also sort of across funder communities. I think we can no longer be siloed because, as we saw, everything is played out in the public sphere, whether it's nuclear weapons policy, working on Women, Peace and Security Act, whatever it may be.
And I think these next few years is our opportunity to do what we say that we want to do. If we want to see a more diverse and anti-racist field, we're going to have to do the work. We're going to have to put our money in different places, and we're going to have to step up to the plate. The same amount of courage that we ask from our grantee partners, we need to ask from ourselves. And I think that the policies that we get, the world that we get as a result of those efforts will be better for it. It's just not going to be on the timeline that we would like to see, but that type of creativity and courage, at least in the nuclear space that we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union, we now need to bring into today.
And I would say, I guess in closing for me, just what this conversation brings up is that with President-elect Biden and Vice President Harris coming in, we can't just stop. I mean, one of the lessons I learned from the Obama days was folks were like, oh, thank God, like, now it's been taken care of. We have the right man, in this case, in office, and we can just sort of rest on our laurels and just kind of take a back seat. And while that is tempting because we're all exhausted, especially this year, I think, one of the lessons for me from the philanthropics perspective is that, like take a celebratory lap around the track, but also like get back on and like continue that marathon training.
Absolutely. And, I think what will help us this time in some ways is the fact that the outcome of the election was not a complete mandate, right, or rejection of the previous 4 years. And I think that will hopefully spur a hunger by those who have been agitating for change to continue the fight.
So Vera, tell me what you are hearing from your grantee partners abroad a few weeks post-election. Here in the US, we focus a lot about what's happening in the US, but I want to hear from you, based on your experience and your relationships abroad, what you're hearing about from folks who are looking in at the US.
I would say, first of all, given the election outcomes, there is some cautious optimism around some of the promises that President-elect Biden made around taxation and illicit financial flows, for example, as well as climate change and re-entry to the Paris Agreement, and also a more proactive, I can say, or maybe a different positioning in terms of multilateralism. So in terms of things like the COVID response and working together, there's some expectation or anticipation that, for example, there would be a return to WHO and perhaps joining the global effort around, the vaccine and distributing the vaccine globally so that everyone has an opportunity to also benefit and have access to it once it's developed. So those are some of the very initial responses that I'm hearing. But more broadly, in terms of US foreign policy and the impact that that'll have, there is far less enthusiasm that there'll be that much of a change, just because historically, whether it's been a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, when it comes to US foreign policy, it's been fairly consistent, or at least the impact has been fairly consistent. So from the conversations that I've had, there isn't a sense that that is going to change dramatically just because there is a new administration going into the office.
I mean, I just saw just before we started this conversation that President-elect Biden has named John Kerry to be his climate envoy, which is exactly in your specific issue area. And so, much changes, much remains the same. Have you heard anything from the grantee partners abroad about the process this year, the process of the elections, or the way in which folks here in the US have either risen up or stayed home? Has there been any kind of reaction from those abroad?
Well, I can say informally, I don't know if you've been checking Twitter, but then there's been a lot of, particularly from colleagues in Africa, who have been surprised by some of the way that the U.S. elections are conducted relative to how they're conducted in many African countries. Like there's no central national electoral commission that has the responsibility of both deciding whether the process is free and fair across the country, as well as announcing the results. So it's been interesting that in the US, it's the media who has that role primarily, and it's sort of state by state that has to announce, which is a very different experience, especially given terms of setting the example of what democracy should look like, or how the rule of law should be set up in your country. That's not the message we've been receiving.
Right.
So to see that actually in the US it plays out very differently has been interesting. I think there's also been some curiosity about how the current president has responded to the results, like not willing to concede and contesting the results through several court cases, and how that sort of mirrors the experience in many African countries. Again, that's an interesting lesson that people are reacting to. And there's been a lot of playful chatter around sending an envoy of African leaders to observe the elections in the US in much the same way that the American or European independent election observers are sent often to African countries to contest, to determine whether or not they were free and fair. So yeah, a lot of playful chatter around that, because it's been, it's live. We're all kind of watching very closely how it has played out. So I think there's been a lot of learning lessons around Oh, wow. I didn't know they did it like that.
And I would say just from PSFG members, I know a lot of them for the first time ever have started looking at our own backyard, as I think you've seen some of the PSFG conversations we've had and said, oh, this is, this looks familiar from the stuff we're funding abroad, but wait a second, now it's happening here. Like, what does that all mean? There's a lot of conversations, internally amongst the funder network about what does that mean? What does that look like? How does it change the way in which we fund or think about our own backyard?
And I think just in terms of then this issue about a different positioning of the US relative to the rest of the world when we're thinking about, the global order, so to speak, that becomes important, I think, or at least it's going to be interesting how that plays out, how people react to or follow the example of the US internationally. I think everyone now knows this electoral college, for example. It's very interesting how that could override popular vote. And just understanding what that means in terms of a democracy. Like, what does that mean? So I think that's something, again, a lesson learning internationally just by observing what's happening in the US and how that plays out.
And just in the remaining couple minutes here, what would you say, just having been a long-time philanthropic professional, both at OSF and now at Ford, are there any lessons learned sort of as a professional in this space for what we could be doing differently moving forward as funders?
I think the major lesson for me is building up global, transnational, cross-thematic movements. Those movements or those actors who are able to see past their borders and understand that some issues are universal and we require each other to be collectively successful. I think that's where the energy needs to go in terms of philanthropy. We're seeing it most clearly in the movement for Black lives in the US and how that has become a global reckoning around racial justice in a way that we just haven't seen. Of course, I think there's something about this year particularly that has created some kind of an opportunity around that, but then to build on that energy, I think it's that form of movement building, which is much harder, but I think it also has prospects of success.
We're about 2 weeks after the election here in the US, and I just want to ask you, Bridget, what's new in peace building in light of the election? What can we expect to see in the next 4 years under a Biden-Harris administration?
Peace building, I think, has an enormous opportunity as well as lots of challenges still ahead under this new administration. I would say one of the biggest lessons from the past year that we're trying to apply within the peace building community is that peace building is not something that is about other conflicts out there. It's not a foreign policy only issue. It's certainly part of the work of how we engage with the world and support communities, safer communities abroad. But this year, it's been very clear that peace building is highly relevant and highly needed in the United States. So I think one of the biggest opportunities under Biden-Harris is the healing of America. And we've heard that language from Biden himself. We see the need for addressing systemic racism in the United States, which is a deep root cause of conflict here, a legacy of our history and an ongoing reality for many communities. And also the deep political divisions that overlay that between red and blue and between the different realities almost that communities in the United States are facing. So I think the big challenge for us as a peace building community is to get out of what has been a more focused international perspective and really think about what is our role and responsibility here at home, working with those communities who are already on the front lines in the United States, dealing with oppression and conflict and violence in our own country. If you track the Global Peace Index, you will see that over the last 10 years, not just under Trump, under Obama as well, the US peacefulness rating has been steadily declining. And so we really have a lot of work to do here in the United States while we also accompany and support communities around the world.
And I know Peace Direct has taken a concerted effort to do this. How do you connect your really great work abroad with that here in the US?
We've done a few things. We have always traditionally started by mapping local peace building efforts in any country where we were engaging. And so we started doing that in the United States a couple of years ago, actually. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of groups around this country working actively at the community level to build peace and address conflict in their neighborhoods and communities. So part of it is just finding out who's out there and what are they doing? And then what is our role to support, help network, provide resources, provide information, and connect them. I think one of the places Peace Direct is really interested in sort of finding our own niche is helping connect the local to local. So how do local peace builders around the world offer lessons, inspiration, resources for communities in the US and vice versa? And how do we actually look at this as a holistic community, global community, as opposed to thinking in this diametric, domestic foreign policy? Actually, there are local communities that could be connected around peace building around the world in here. So that's one of the things that we really want to be able to do.
And you've talked a little bit about what funders can be doing. So providing resourcing, networking their grantees or other grantees, collaborating. What are some of the other lessons learned from the past 4 years, or as you mentioned, sort of 4+ years that you can apply to the funding community with your peers? What would you challenge them to do in the next 4 years to change the way in which they've been operating?
I think there's a whole fundamental shift, which PSFG has been, I think, at the forefront of in thinking about the role of philanthropy and what that means for addressing global systems of racism and colonization, really. So we just held a consultation on decolonizing aid and peace building to really listen to local peace builders around the world as to what they have experienced in terms of how funding and aid reinforces systems of injustice and oppression, and what can we do to undo those systems. So it's a lot of the same lessons, frankly, that we've been hearing for years about how funding is provided, who gets to decide how funding is directed, who gets to decide what is a peace building program, and who gets to design it. And then how is funding, really given over in a way that allows communities to own and sustain their efforts. And there's a lot, I don't want to get into all the issues of procurement, and we've done research on that together already about, trying to make more flexible funding. But I think a lot of it gets down to some of those practicalities.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we're going to continue to provide that programming to you and peers in the PSFG community. And I agree, it's one of the most difficult things that we've been doing for lots of reasons, and including people are on different places in their journey around this, if we put it that way, and because it's lifelong work. I guess just in the last couple of minutes we have together, I wanted to ask you, because you have worked on the Hill, or worked with the Hill rather, for many, many years. So I'm curious, is there anything the 117th Congress can do to catapult peace building and the work that you're doing with partners around the world?
Actually, we've started looking much more closely at legislation that was introduced this year by Representative Omar called the Global Peace Building Act. It was largely a symbolic bill when it was introduced, but we've been working with other peace building groups and groups that have traditionally worked on cutting Pentagon spending to bring those communities together and really look at how could we shift resources that have been going to militarization and defense military spending to invest in peace building at home and abroad. So we're looking at both how do you craft a new Global Peace Building Act that would be much more substantive, that would put peace building on the map in Congress, and also really start to shift resources. This is decades-long work that everybody in this community has been trying to do. But I think part of what we've missed is having not just, you got to cut this wasteful military spending because it's failing, but what are you invested in? And this is where the peace building community, I think, has a lot to offer, to say, let us show you what you can invest it in and give you really practical ways of doing that.
Tell me a little bit more about what do you think funders can be doing in this new moment around peace building?
So I think there's a real opportunity, given the momentum around shifting towards more flexible funding for peace building, to look at even more creative ways of getting resources directly to the people on the front lines in a consolidated, coordinated way as a philanthropy community. So other sectors, human rights, women's issues, have global funds, multi-donor funds, private-public collaborations that actually pool resources and direct them to be most effective. And I think it's time for us to really think about a global fund for peace building, what that would look like, and how it could be created in the next few years. There is actually an opening under the Global Fragility Act for a new multi-donor fund potentially, so we could even think about partnering with government on it. But I think in any case, PSFG members have a huge role to play as leaders already in funding peace building, in thinking about a new type of global fund.
I'm curious if you can just tell us a little bit about what are some of the opportunities for women, peace, and security in the next Congress, especially with the caucus that you launched and vis-a-vis the incoming Biden administration.
Sure, the 117th Congress is going to be really interesting. I think nobody really knows. But I do think under the Biden administration, we do know that there are some elements that will remain consistent. We know that President-elect Biden has always supported issues such as ending violence against women. When he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he did have a really deep understanding of women's roles and women's rights and democratic movements. I think what the incoming people will have to do is review the current status of where we are in terms of policies and legislation. So both executive branch, legislative branch, and I think as civil society, we need to help with that process, because certainly the new administration will want to improve upon or come up with their own strategies. But we already have a Women, Peace, and Security Act, which is law. We have the Atrocity Prevention Act, also a law. All of these types of legislation, which have already been passed, have mandates. And one of the challenges, I think, for our friends within government who are going to stay in their position as civil servants is the lack of policy coherence. And actually, there is a lot of coherence between them, but the way that we've been doing this work has been very siloed. I see a real role, for civil society to play in educating the new people coming into Congress and the new administration on how these pieces of legislation actually work very well together and are complementary and can be reinforcing to have a stronger US foreign policy, actually, that is more towards peace and security instead of being very divisive and causing unintended consequences where we just aren't paying attention to questions such as where does gender fit into the Global Fragility Act? And I think this also goes to the point of what is women, peace, and security about? In the 20 years that it existed, the purpose of it has been to bring a feminist perspective to foreign policymaking. And not just a feminist perspective, but actual actions that can transform foreign policymaking and international relations with a feminist, peaceful agenda. So bringing the two things that are really actionable by all governments, using a gender analysis in all of their understanding of any kind of security issue, which really broadens the sense of what is security. And then the second is increasing women's participation in decision making at all levels. And then, of course, they would say the third thing is consultation with civil society, particularly women-led civil society. And those three actions can be taken by all levels of government, all action points in government, strategic, operational, tactical levels, and civil society can participate in educating at all of those levels, and perhaps can be part of decision making at those levels. His previous record just shows that he is a champion of gender equality, and his selection of vice president shows that he's not only champion of gender equality, but understands the importance of diversity and inclusion, equity issues. So I do think there's a lot of promise.
With the hope of turning a new leaf and continuing the hard work, what is a challenge that you would offer up to some funders to do things a bit differently moving forward?
Where civil society has a role, and funders in particular, is first understanding that civil servant actors, I should say, within government, who are going to be there no matter what the administration is, those are the people we really need to support and educate and help them advocate and do their job, because they are committed to these issues no matter who is in the administration. And it's also their responsibility to fulfill the mandates. And they're really in a bind when they both have an administration that doesn't want to fulfill the mandate, and also they have civil society pushing them to do things they can't do. So I'm looking for places where we can actually find ways to push the issue forward And a lot of times that's about socialization of ideas and advocating and creating more spaces for civil society to bring their perspectives and bring their ideas to the table. This year, with our partnership with the McCain Institute and others, we were able to bring high-level senior government officials together with women in Sudan, high-level senior government officials together with women in Belarus to actually have these types of conversations, and virtually. And that just wouldn't have, I mean, it would have taken a long time, and it certainly wouldn't have happened even in the way that it happened, like the way the conversations are happening. This is like really giving civil society women leaders and those men who also support gender equality and democracy and human rights more of a platform to, and more time to air their thoughts, their opinions, their ideas, their strategies in this sort of dialogue setting of the virtual space. You know, one of the calls to action by the leadership of the new administration is to do things in a bipartisan way, to work together, to find points of collaboration. We are not going to agree on most things. We do have to find a common ground and push that common ground forward together. Right. Otherwise it won't work. And I think that, you know, that is one of the hallmarks of women, peace, and security. There's a lot of debate within the feminist community about anti-militarization and that is really a feminist perspective or a feminist view of how we do security. But I think pragmatically speaking, we're not going to see the end of militaries around the world, maybe not in my lifetime. Okay, they exist. So how do we actually engage those institutions to transform in a positive way for everyone? So that does require difficult conversations with people in DoD, Republican counterparts that you maybe never have talked to. Those are really challenging conversations, but also very necessary. I do think that that's important, and I think it's important to do it on the House side and the Senate side. I think it's important for civil society to lead that kind of conversation, to demonstrate that kind of leadership and vision, because I think Peace and Security Funders Group, that is a lot of what, as a group, we fund are these peace and dialogue activities.
I mean, women, peace and security, gender and conflict, DEI, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, those shouldn't be partisan issues. Those are universal issues. Human rights are universal. And so, yeah, as you say, taking that step as a community, as a funder community, as civil society, and talking the talk, walking the walk, whatever the expression is. But you've done that in launching with like clearly bipartisan leadership in the House. And so, and hopefully, yeah, I mean, hopefully funders can step up and, you know, even as you said, sort of on a personal level, reach out to their members of Congress. You know, we're all funders, but we're also citizens that belong to congressional districts. And so sharing the importance of these issues to us and encouraging our members, our representatives to actually take a look at the Women, Peace and Security Caucus and how might they work with their brethren across the aisle to really get all these things that we want to have happen.
I think it's going to be an exciting time, this new administration, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities. But I also think that we do have to be realistic about what we're actually going to be able to accomplish, because I think this administration is coming in with, I think everybody knows this is coming with a big challenge, either halting or reversing a lot of negative policies. So our job, I think, is to keep the momentum going and keep our shoulder to the wheel on these issues of peace and security, but demonstrate a willingness to cooperate, demonstrate a willingness to educate and talk to, open dialogue, and make it easier for the government actors, basically grease the wheel so that it makes it easier for them to do what they can do, right? Because otherwise they're going to come in and basically be just doing a lot of firefighting, right, and not rebuilding, right? And I think that would be a lost opportunity. So I think we do have a lot of momentum just in the broader public, and I think strategically speaking, the Peace and Security Funders Group could really be a voice as a group of actors to push an ask, you know, about funding, about greater engagement from the administration on this level, or even education, so that we do it in a bipartisan way. We can to keep the momentum going on these issues, right? but it's not just one actor at a time, that they really see a united front.
And a united support mechanism, as you said, it can be, as you were a senior policymaker, can be lonely to be on the inside kind of doing this work, but knowing that there are folks on the outside who kind of have your back, who can, help out, be it, commission a research paper that, maybe you can't do when you're in the government, or pull together, as you said, sort of a group of Afghan women and kind of beam them in through the Zoom to be, to be a sounding board. I think that's like just knowing that there's someone out there who shares your same values, shares your same goals. And I think that for me, that's the beauty of being in philanthropy, is that it's, we do share those things and we're not as tied up with red tape as bureaucrat peers are. And so we can sort of lend a hand, as you said, and just offer sort of partnership in whatever ways sort of makes sense, because we do have those same common goals.
The other advantage of the philanthropic community is that we have the ability to think in a longer strategic vision, because yes, the administration comes in and out and there are different political agendas, but the funders are always hopefully there and and can collectively have a longer strategic vision, collectively and individually. And I think, harnessing that collective vision would be really powerful, and can really change a lot of things for the positive. So
Moni, the elections happened a few weeks ago. We know President-elect Biden is gearing up for the transition, but I want to ask you about what have you been hearing from grantee partners? What is your analysis of the elections and what it means for cybersecurity?
One of the things I did want to mention at the outset is that I'm expressing my personal views on this versus my institution's views, meaning the Hewlett Foundation. I think cyber, for the most part, has avoided politicization. The only part of cyber that's become politicized is disinformation, as we saw with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's rumor control site, which was geared to debunk baseless election-related conspiracy theories that unfortunately President Trump and his allies were promoting. And so I should note that although CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's former and immensely respected director, Chris Krebs, was terminated on the 17th of the month, the site is still up. But more specifically, to address your question in terms of reflections that the recent US elections could have on the field of cyber, I want to focus on a few high-level themes and how they would develop under a Biden administration. So what I'll touch on is number one, Russia; number two, election security; number three, cyber diplomacy; number four, thinking about different things that were implemented under Trump's administration that could potentially work under a Biden administration. And lastly, I'd like to focus on a specific recommendation from the congressionally mandated Cyber Solarium Commission. So to start, I think a Biden administration will elevate the importance of cyber issues, even as the president-elect preserves several of the Trump administration's key initiatives. One individual that I oftentimes make reference to in the context of cyber issues is Chris Painter. He served as the top US cyber diplomat from 2011 to 2017 in the Department of State. And he recently said that what we'll see is a recommitment to cyber as being an important issue. So specifically, I want to start off with Russia. I think under a Biden administration, we'll see a more aggressive tone towards Russia. The Trump administration has avoided criticizing Russian President Vladimir Putin's regime, but I think Biden will be more likely to confront Moscow over its cyber attacks, threats to its neighbors, and efforts to disrupt Western elections. So that's one primary change that I want to highlight. Number two, in the context of election security, I think there will be a new focus on election security. During the Trump administration, agencies like CISA protected American elections despite Trump rather than because of him. And I think under a Biden administration that will change. And election security will be a primary focus within localities, within states, and certainly across the federal government. Number three, cyber diplomacy. I think the administration's nationalistic posturing has alienated key allies. Trump has also shifted away from cyber diplomacy by downgrading Chris Painter's old office at the Department of State. But I do think under a Biden administration, this will change, particularly given Biden's plans to name his longtime advisor, Anthony Blinken, to serve as Secretary of State, something that was recently announced. And just for context, Blinken was a top foreign policy official during the Obama administration. And while he never specifically focused on cybersecurity, he's likely to emphasize an Obama-era approach in terms of priorities. It's like building cybersecurity alliances and really stressing global norms. And I should note, I mean, Trump officials didn't abandon those efforts, but focused more on threatening digital adversaries such as China and Iran, especially under former National Security Advisor John Bolton, as opposed to focusing on more cyber diplomatic efforts. And I also think it's important, safe to say, that cybersecurity lawmakers also plan to push the administration to reinstate a top cyber ambassador position, which was eliminated early on during the Trump administration. The fourth item that I wanted to talk about is just highlighting some of the things that a Biden administration might keep from what was put into effect under a Trump administration. So Trump took two important steps in 2018 that have been widely celebrated by the cyber community. Number one, he signed an order authorizing US Cyber Command to conduct digital strikes without the president's direct approval, as had been required under the Obama administration. And Cyber Command has used this expanded authority to more aggressively repel America's digital adversaries. The second thing that happened under the Trump administration is he signed a law that created the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And CISA has earned praise for its partnerships with election officials across states and sectors, but also with critical infrastructure operators. And so I think Biden will probably preserve Cyber Command's new authority and advocate for expanding CISA's funding. However, I do think he might decide to review Cyber Command's defending forward strategy and will likely find it difficult to replace CISA's widely respected director, Chris Krebs. Though I should know Krebs planned for his departure and unfortunate ultimate termination in advance by making Brandon Wells, who's a 15-year respected DHS veteran, the executive director of CISA, and who is now serving as the acting director of CISA following his termination. And then the fifth thing I did want to talk about in a Biden context is the Cyber Solarium Commission. So just to briefly explain, the commission was established in 2019 within the National Defense Authorization Act, and it is a bipartisan, intergovernmental, and multi-sector body charged with evaluating divergent approaches to defending the US in cyberspace and driving consensus towards a comprehensive strategy. And one of the recommendations from the commission was the creation of a national cyber director, which, for example, Representative Jim Langevin from Rhode Island, who's also one of the co-founders of the Congressionally Cybersecurity Caucus, said that former NSA Deputy Director Chris Inglis would be his pick for this role. But I also think having a person who would be able to coordinate the cybersecurity flow of information to the executive branch and would also be able to coordinate the strategy to defend against these types of cyber attacks is essential, especially during a global pandemic where we're all forced to embrace virtual environments for day-to-day activities. To provide context on that insight, in 2018, the Trump administration eliminated the job of the nation's cybersecurity czar at the White House, citing the importance of streamlining management and improving efficiency and reducing bureaucracy and increasing accountability. And frankly, Democratic lawmakers immediately introduced legislation to restore it. And the cybersecurity community also just had serious qualms with the elimination of that role. But I would argue that that was a step in the wrong direction. Cyber threats are ever changing and growing and more sophisticated by the day. So at least from my perspective, there was no logical reason in terms of eliminating the senior position and reducing the already degraded level of cyber expertise at the White House. In fact, I think we should be investing in our nation's cyber defense, not rolling it back, which is why I think the Cyber Solariums Commission recommendation to create a national cyber director makes sense to me. Those are just the high-level insights that come to mind in terms of where I think the field of cybersecurity will go under a Biden administration versus a Trump one.